So welcome to tonight's webinar, Memories of Migration Russlaender 100 Tour Ontario Events Preview. My name is Aileen Friesen, and I am the co-director, along with my colleague, Dr. Ben Nobbs-Thiessen, of the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies at the University of Winnipeg. The center is located on the ancestral and traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Anishinaabe, Assiniboine, Cree, Dakota, Dene, and on the heartland of the Red River Métis Nation. I invite you to think about the peoples who cared for and nurtured the territory that you are currently on. We are here tonight to share with the community some exciting summer plans to commemorate the Russlaender centenary. 100 years ago this summer, the first group of Mennonites left Khortytsa, Soviet Ukraine, and arrived in Quebec City, traveling onwards through to Rostron, Saskatchewan. They left a land decimated by violence, famine, and epidemic. They were fortunate to find shelter in Canada, and this summer, across Canada, events are being organized to celebrate the faith of these newcomers, to remember the loss of their former communities, to memorialize the challenges of resettlement, and to acknowledge the role of racialized immigration policies that favored some groups at the expense of others, and the continued displacement of Indigenous peoples through a new wave of settler colonialism. In other words, this commemoration is a time for reflection on a multi-layered story. The Russlaender Centenary Committee has organized this cross-Canada train tour, starting in Quebec City to Abbotsford, which will have a stop in Kitchener-Waterloo. The tour is officially fully subscribed. All 3 legs of the tour are full. And this evening, we will hear about the events being planned in Ontario. I will now turn it over to the chair of the Ontario Russlaender Centenary Committee, Marlene Epp, Professor Emeritus of History at Conrad Grebel University College. Marlene is well known for her scholarship on Mennonite history, focused on issues of gender, immigration, and food culture. And before I pass over to Marlene, I just want to remind everyone that if you have any questions that come up during this webinar, please don't put them in the chat. You can chat with each other in the chat, but please put your questions in the Q&A, and we will have time for questions after all of the presentations. So I will now hand it over to Marlene.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Aileen, for that introduction. Welcome to this webinar on the Russlaender in Ontario. As Aileen said, I'm a retired professor of history at Conrad Grebel University College, and I'm chairing the Ontario Planning Group for the Russlaender Centenary, and I'm happy to have my colleagues here with me tonight. I have a fairly homogeneous immigrant ancestry, as all 4 of my grandparents immigrated to Canada from Ukraine in 1924. The speakers today would also like to acknowledge that we are located on the ancestral and treaty territory of the original peoples of the Neutral Nation, the Haudenosaunee of the Grand River, and the Anishinaabe people of the Mississauga Nation. We give thanks to these Indigenous nations that continue to live on the lands to which our ancestors came, and that have shared this land with us. In this webinar tonight, we will introduce you to the Russlaender story in Ontario. Some of the information, such as the bus tours, is specific to passengers on the first leg of Tour Imagination's Russlaender 100 train tour across Canada. These tours may be reprised in the future. Other information tonight will be relevant to anyone interested in Russlaender history. We are hosting one public event titled The Place of Memory, Reflections on the Russlaender Centenary on Monday, July 10th, and I will put a link to details about that event in the chat later. So let me introduce the speakers this evening. Henry Paetkau will offer an overview of Russlaender history in Ontario. Henry has provided senior leadership for many Mennonite institutions in Canada and currently chairs the National Russlaender Centenary Committee. He has completed considerable research on Russlaender settlement in Ontario in the 1920s and 30s. Laureen Harder-Gissing is the archivist librarian at the Mennonite Archives of Ontario at Conrad Grebel. She grew up in the Vineland, Ontario Russlaender community. Laureen will introduce you to Russlaender-related collections in the archives especially digital material that is now accessible to everybody. Leonard Enns is an internationally known composer and conductor and retired professor of music at Conrad Grebel. He will offer an overview of his original composition, The Place of Memory, to be premiered on July 10th in Waterloo and performed by Da Capo Chamber Choir with cellist Miriam Stewart-Craker. Len is also a Ruslender descendant. David G. Neufeld will talk about the bus trip through the Niagara Peninsula on July 11th. David is the son of Ruslender immigrants, his parents both arriving in Canada as small children with their families in 1926. Dave was coordinator of education at the Waterloo Region Museum. He is now retired. Ed Janzen will talk about the other tour option for July 11th, a bus trip through Mennonite country, as we call it, north and west of Kitchener-Waterloo. Ed Janzen is retired chaplain and instructor at Conrad Grebel. He's a wood hobbyist, gardener, and sailor. Our speakers will talk in that order, and Henry, please begin.
Thank you, Marlene, and good evening, everyone, and welcome. Good to have you with us for this overview and introduction to the first leg, and specifically the Ontario segment of the Russlaender 100 tour. Let me set a context briefly in Ontario, into which the Russlaender Mennonites arrived in 1924, which was when the first group arrived here. Mennonites had been in Ontario, of course, for well over 100 years. Swiss Old Order and Amish Mennonites had arrived in the late 1700s, early 1800s on, and settled in primarily southern Ontario, southwest southern Ontario, but were largely invisible in many respects, one might say. Some had settled along the 20-Mile Creek, so-called, in the Niagara Peninsula, starting in 1786. Others along the north shore of Lake Erie, and then the largest settlement began in what is now Waterloo Region in 1800. Well, jumping forward then to the 1920s, in 1921, the census, the Canadian census, registered 13,645 Mennonites in Ontario. So this would have been the descendants of those Swiss who had moved up from the US, and some had come directly from Europe. So almost 14,000. Over half of these lived in what was then Waterloo North and Waterloo South, which included the cities of Kitchener and Waterloo, of Galt, Hespeler, Cambridge, Preston, now Cambridge, that vicinity. So over half were concentrated in that area, though largely rural there. And Mennonites here accounted for about 9.5% of Waterloo County population. Well, then the arrival of more than 1,300 Russian Mennonites in 1924 changed the composition of Mennonites here noticeably, if not dramatically, at least at first, adding 10% to the Mennonite population in Ontario in that year alone. About a third of those who arrived in 24 moved west the following year. That had been their original intention or destination, and actually the commitment that had been made that they would settle in the West on farmland there. But others arrived in the following years, following family or friends and opportunities in Ontario. And there was an ebb and flow back and forth between west and back east in the 1920s, particularly toward the end of the 20s, as disillusioned folks from the prairies either returned or turned to Ontario for opportunities there. Now, most of the first arrivals in 1924 were accommodated in Kitchener-Waterloo in the vicinity, although some as far as 20 or 30 kilometers away from Kitchener-Waterloo. And others were picked up, a few in Toronto at Union Station and taken to Markham, where there were some Swiss Mennonites, and about a dozen families to Vineland Station area, where there was a larger settlement as well. So initially, this was quite a mix as these folks met each other. And put in a plug here for Marlene Epp's paper presented at the Winnipeg conference for those who are on this first leg of the tour, or the second leg of the tour, I should say, but others could register as well, I think, and catch it. The Ruslender encounter the Swiss in Ontario, or one could say vice versa too. The Swiss encounter the Russlaender, and it would be an interesting story to hear. So what made these Russian Mennonites, if not unique, at least different from their hosts, and challenged the relationship between them? Well, first was the experience of isolation. Of course, they had shared the experience of suffering and deprivation that their hosts could hardly understand or appreciate. And many families were separated, depending on where there was work for them, at least for a time. And so this dispersion and the distance added to the sense of isolation and alienation. And they sought ways to gather together and rebuild or build those relationships rather than relationships with their hosts. So it was the experience of isolation. They were also impoverished. Most, certainly in the first year, came on credit with CP and had substantial travel debt to pay. And initially working on farms as farm laborers and domestics didn't provide significant income. And they needed more than just room and board to sustain themselves and to pay off the debt. They also came with higher expectations than perhaps one could say the more simple rural life of the Swiss, given the context out of which they came. And moreover, farm labor was largely seasonal. The farming was different. And this position of servitude was new to most of them. In February 25, there was a report from Ontario in the Mennonitische Rundschau, which expressed this, saying, the majority wish to be freed of the position of servitude and strive to go on their own as soon as possible. Now, many, of course, had also been educated to a certain extent. Some were trained in the trades and as teachers and professionals. And so there was a draw to towns and cities where they could employ those skills, those gifts, that training, and work at steadier employment for higher wages in the shops and factories there. And this, of course, conflicted with their commitment to settle on the land. The question of farms or factories became a major public debate throughout the Mennonite community in Der Bote and the Mennonitische Rundschau, the periodicals that had regular reports from these various locations and the folks. And they also, in Ontario, at least in Kitchener-Waterloo area, came into conflict with local labor as the 1920s unfolded, and the depression began to set in, the labor unrest and so on. And there was a certain resentment against them, and also a certain insinuation that they were becoming proletarianized. And some of their leaders used that term as a way of either reprimanding them or encouraging them to go on the land. And that designation stung significantly for folks who had come out of the Soviet Union, and that became a point of contention even with their own leaders. But this was the beginning of the urbanization of Mennonites in Ontario. And by 1927, more than 1/3 of the almost 2,000 Russian Mennonites in Ontario were settled in urban areas. And so that was the beginning of that move. There were also several new rural areas of settlement, of farm settlement. One was in Essex County, Leamington, Pelee Island, Harrow, Windsor, although that was in the factories, but a significant number moved 1925 and on to farm and in that area. And another group moved north to Reeser, about 950 kilometers northwest of Kitchener-Waterloo, between Kapuskasing and Hearst. And that settlement thrived for some time, and folks from the west also began to settle there. And then in Niagara, as you will hear from David shortly, a significant growth there as well on farms that they purchased and subdivided. So the Mennonite population in Ontario then increased by about 4,000 from 1921 to 1931. And this was largely due to the arrival of Russian Mennonites coming directly here or coming here from the West to seek employment. Finally, a comment about how they met some of their challenges. These newcomers demonstrated the penchant for organization and cooperation to respond to their challenges and difficulties, to the changes they were experiencing, that same penchant that they had demonstrated in Russia earlier. And so they began to organize and collaborate in response to the challenges of dispersion, of their spiritual and social needs, their financial challenges, and even personal difficulties. They organized congregations immediately and identified leaders. The two Janzens were the most significant, perhaps at the outside, Jacob H. Janzen in the General Conference and H. Janzen, the Mennonite Brethren leader. The secular organizations, one could say, which were not directly church related, although there was a bit of a conflict there, or a disagreement about whether they were church related or not. More secular organizations such as the Central Mennonite Immigrant Committee, which was also a national committee. The first provincial one was organized in Ontario by B.B. Weeds. And he articulated the needs of the newcomers in issues of mutual aid, establishing a burial society, and things like that, which Janzen, J.H. Janzen, thought should be directly related and outgrowth of the church ministry. And B.B. Weeds wanted those two distinguished. That became not only a sort of a leadership conflict, but a family conflict when B.B. Weeds married a daughter of J.H. Janzen. And the two needed some distance, so they alternatively moved to British Columbia. Well, then finally, you'll have an opportunity to recall the experiences of these newcomers, to see and hear about some of those first areas of settlement and places of significance and interest that you'll hear more about shortly. That'll be part of the tours. Looking forward to seeing some of you on the tour, and I'll pass it over now to Laureen.
Thank you, Henry. So those of you who know me might wonder why I'm looking particularly glamorous this evening. This necklace I'm wearing specially today because it belonged to my grandmother, a woman I never met named Mary Braun Harder. And she died in the 1930s when my dad was young, but I did inherit some of her jewelry, and so that's one way I have connected with her and with her as a Ruslender young woman. And it's just a reminder too that for those of us who grew up in Ruslender communities of following generations, we might tend to think of the Ruslander as older people, but they were young as well. They were teenagers, they were young people, and children with much ahead of them in life. So that's why I'm wearing this particular necklace today. I'm just going to take a moment now and share my screen. And I've called my little presentation here Art, Arbors, Archives, and Anticipation. The A's just seem to come together for me here. So I'm going to give you a little preview of what it will be like to be here at Conrad Grebel College in July. But also for those of you who are not going to be here, there'll be some things that you can take advantage of as well. So if you have not been here before, this is Conrad Grebel University College on the University of Waterloo campus, a Mennonite college affiliated with the University of Waterloo, and we have both a residence and an academic program. Conrad Grebel started in 1963, and here we see representatives not only of Ruslender, but of Swiss Mennonite and Amish Mennonite leaders breaking the ground for the college. And so over the years those early years as Henry described, and those early meetings eventually turned into a lot of cooperation between the different Mennonite groups in Ontario, and the college where I work is one of those examples of that cooperation. So, what art will you see when you come here? I am very happy to be the curator for the Conrad Grebel art collection, and you may be able to see behind me a little bit in the corners. I have some art on my walls that I specifically chose, and one of them is a painting by this man, Henry Pauls. And he donated a substantial collection of his work to the college in 1983, and here he is introducing his art to the college. Henry was a self-taught painter who started later in life, and he very deliberately depicted Ruslender Mennonite stories from his youth, and wove details of his life and experiences into his paintings. So that is one of the artists that you will be able to see, not the artist, rather his paintings you will be able to see as you come through the college. We'll have a special exhibit of his work. And along with his work, we also have another artist, Waldemar Neufeld, about the same time period, a Ruslander-born artist. He took a very different path, though, from Henry Pauls. He became a professional artist, and he spent most of his career in the United States. But he studied in Canada, and he was one of the stepchildren of J.H. Janzen, who Henry mentioned, one of the leaders in Ontario. And here he is with some of his siblings looking at one of the paintings that he donated to us. So two very different Ruslander artists that you'll be able to see their work and discuss when you come here. So now on to the arbors, or the grounds of the college. And we have an area outside of our buildings here that we have designated for different Mennonite commemorations. And the top picture you see there is a Russian Mennonite memorial garden, and the large tree that's surrounded by the gravel walkway is in fact a descendant of the famous Cortitza oak that we have managed to nurture and keep alive. And you will be able to see that when you are here, and we are hoping that there will also be an art installation related to that while you are here. The picture below that one is where you see a number of people standing around. This is the site of a garden that commemorates the Swiss Mennonites from Pennsylvania coming to Ontario, with the black walnut tree, which was a symbol of their coming here. And what we are doing here in this picture is creating an Indigenous garden to commemorate the Indigenous Mennonite Conference, which was held here last year, almost exactly to the day, and just to take part in Truth and Reconciliation, to bring the Indigenous story into our settler story and understand our settler story in relation to the longer Indigenous story on this land. So we can talk about that some more when you come. There is also a ceremonial firegrounds nearby and tended by the Waterloo Indigenous Student Center, and we will visit that as well. Archives, the place where I live here. This is the entrance to the library and archives at Conrad Grebel. And I will be bringing out a number of things that I think you'll find very interesting, artifacts, records of Russlaender and Anabaptist history more broadly. And we will hear some stories about Swiss and Russian encounters in Ontario as well. And we will be able to hear a little bit more about Indigenous Mennonite encounters. I have an exhibit that is running currently called Against the Grain, and it focuses on Indigenous stories as they appear in Mennonite archival documents. So you will have a chance to see that as well. And of course, as I said, it's running right now. So if any of you are not on the tour but would like to come and see, you're welcome to see that as well. Finally, anticipation. Now, I am married to a man who will get in a car, get on a plane, and just kind of go and not do much preparation. He enjoys just experiencing whatever happens to him on a journey. I am a little different in that I like to read in advance and see pictures of where I'm going and think about it a lot. So if you're like me, here's some things you could do in anticipation of your trip. I have created a website called Russlaender Immigrants to Ontario, Sources and Stories. And here is the URL for that, Russlaender. You should probably be able to spell that by now. You've probably seen it enough times. Russlaender.omeka, OMEKA.net. And on this site, you will see records from our archives about the Russlaender experience. And on the side of the page here, you will say where it says recently added items, that just today I added some records from the Leamington United Mennonite Church. The Essex-Kent Mennonite Historical Society has been very gracious to loan us their church records from Leamington Church, and so I am just beginning to digitize those records. And so this site will grow and expand as more documents are added. So check back often. There are a number of collections here that you could explore. We have an amazing set of oral history tapes that were done in the 1970s by a young student at the time named Henry Paetkau. And some of them are listed here with transcripts, and we hope to add more transcripts as time goes on. But you can also check the biographies here and look at the listing, and maybe you can discover a long lost relative or someone you knew and you'd like to hear their voice again. And if so, just let me know. Most of these interviews have now been digitized, and so you would be able to listen to them. Another series that's could be very intriguing is the lists of immigrants and the places where they were billeted and the congregations where they were billeted. I find this one kind of interesting. This is the list of families desired from Ontario. So this was made up by the Swiss Mennonite hosts, and individuals indicated what type of family they would like to house and what kind of work they might have for that family. It reminds me a little bit of Anne of Green Gables when Matthew Cuthbert goes off to specifically get a boy, and well, he came back with a girl. But this is very much what the local families might be able to offer in terms of employment and housing. And finally, I want to quickly show you this area here, church registers, and you could probably spend hours and hours and hours here. I know I already have. These are registers from different Russlaender churches across Ontario from the 1920s. And you can go through them page by page. Some of them are indexed. And I'll just show you an example here of what one looks like. So you can see this one's having a little trouble loading. Maybe I'll stick with this one. So there's just so much information here. That's the fun part. The part at the top always tells you the immigrant journey of that particular family. And then you see the family members, where they were born, where they were baptized, where they were married, how many children they have. And this, you can start to think about, well, what would it have been like for them with their children being that age to make the journey? Here's another family that's interesting because it has gone through so many transformations. Catherine Clausen was listed as a witwe, a widow, and then it lists her children, and then it lists her deceased husband and his first wife and their children, and you can start to see how these journeys would have played out for different people. So sometimes you can discover relatives, and sometimes it's just fun to read through and try to imagine what the lives of these people would have been like. The other thing that you will see on these pages is it will say, oh, they went to Waterloo, or they came from Leamington, or they went to Vineland. And so there was a lot of movement around. And because we have all of the different registers that are being listed on this site, you will be able to follow families from community to community as well. I'm going to stop there because that's a lot already. And I hope this gives you something to look through if that's what you like to do. But otherwise, I hope to see you in July.
My name is Leonard Enns. I know it's Leonard Enns, as Marlene mentioned. Every time I see that picture of the new Canadians walking up Herb Street, I keep wondering if my mom is one of those 7-year-old girls in the lineup there. She was at some point in some lineup. So I was commissioned to write a piece for this event, a composition. Marlene approached me about that. I was looking at the records in summer of 1920, and COVID has sort of sliced the whole thing into our lives. I think I will just, perhaps the easiest is just to read the program notes. I wish I could share a sound file, but there is no sound file since it'll be premiered on that day in July. I've called the piece "The Place of Memory," with the permission of Connie Brown, who I saw is also on this webinar. It's from a book of hers, a book of poetry called Unspoken. And her first poem, from which I use a small part, actually deals with the complexity of that concept of the place of memory. Is the place of memory a place that we remember? Is the place of memory the place where we remember? Or is the question, what is the place of memory in the way our lives have taken on a shape and so on? And I can't claim to be able to address any of those, but I've tried to choose poetry by 3 poems by Mennonite authors, 1 actually by a Jewish poet, poems that address some of these issues. So it's a suite of four pieces for choir and cello. And the cello, I mean, for me, the cello is a cello, but I mean, it's part of the music. But I think perhaps it also is that memory which can't really be spoken, but is always there. It's sort of that kind of a thread. So the first piece is called An Old Photograph, and it's a poem by Audrey Paetkau, and makes references to some of the things we've talked about here. I'll just read the poem. By this place where the first ones came is an old oak tree, obviously the Russian oak. The tree is hundreds of years old. Under the tree is a picnic. Over the picnic is a branch with a boy with bare feet. The tree is still there. And it's sort of a nostalgic recollection of the life in the country, in the previous land. 2 of the sections of this suite have a brief opportunity for audience to sing along. So in this particular piece, I've used a snippet of the song "Wer pflanzte die Blumen ins grüne Feld? Das hat der Vater im Himmel getan." That one, which some people will know and some people won't know, but there'll be the opportunity to sing along. The second piece, which reminds me of Henry's comments about the disillusionment of people who went to the West and then some who came back, which is part of my story, which there's a connection with Laureen here, because Laureen, your grandmother, of course, is my aunt, and we're all nested together. I know that. So the second movement, the text is by Sarah Clausen, and she's actually writing from a Winnipeg experience. But it's the disillusionment of that experience that drove a lot of my mother's family back to Ontario, where they became fruit farmers and that sort of thing. Her words: "When you find it, the promised land is a narrow river of mud. A river that wraps itself like glue around your Russian boots and bicycle wheels. The fierce sun grinds it to dust. The wind flings howling in your face. Winters, your children get lost in its wild raging. Evenings, you will dream of the lost paradise. Wind breathing through the gold bright wheat fields, fragrance of apple orchards in spring. You'll pore over pictures of majestic horses you harness to your Sunday carriages, camels, herds of fat cattle. Such dreaming must be unlearned." That's just a portion of the whole poem, but that's the part that I've used. But it's this, that the piece is called The Promised Land, that movement. The third movement I've called Silence. And this movement has text from Connie Brown's longer poem, which opens her poetry collection. For me, and I think this is an experience shared by others. The memory that my father didn't share, he shared through silence. He must have had memories. He was 12 years old, 11, 12 years old when he came to Canada. But I think I think the expression of trauma often takes that form, and it's not a healthy form, I expect, but that's the reality. So that's that movement. The section from Connie's poem that I've used is this: after they're gone, those I love dwell in memory, but what of those forgotten memories? There's too painful to unearth, buried in the ground of elsewhere, in the past of then. History, and she ends by saying, history is a silent country. That's followed immediately by the fourth movement, which has a text by the Jewish poet Yehoshua November, and I'm sure he's writing in reference to the Jewish Holocaust, but I think one can transfer the emotional and psychological experience to other situations. So I would say that movement it follows directly on the third, but it focuses on transformation, on that moment. I'm going to read from my notes here. On that moment and that place of silence and tears, when a memory floods back, the place becomes holy. The physical place. Perhaps it's a graveyard, perhaps it's an open field, perhaps it's a kitchen table. The exact place where the memory occurs becomes holy, and we revisit that place. It becomes a holy place. Into this movement, I've nested the hymn, Befiehl du deine Wege. Commit your ways unto God, commit whatever grieves you. It's woven into this movement. I might just read that poem, and then I will leave this brief overview. November writes, sometimes a man will start crying in the middle of the street without knowing why or for whom. It is as though someone else is standing there holding his briefcase, wearing his coat. And from beneath the rust of years come to his tongue the words of his childhood. God, and I'm sorry, and do not be far from me. And just as suddenly the tears are gone and the man walks back into his life, and the place where he cried becomes holy. So that is how I've left that. It does end with a big holy, holy, a big multi-voiced holy. So I hope it doesn't leave people, sort of rolling in the ditch. But that's what I wrote, and that's what you're going to get. I did also do a short composition of the blessing that we all know, Der Herr segne dich und behüte dich, and I've nested that together with the Lutkin blessing that I think many of us know, and I'm so glad it's back in the new hymn book, the Lord bless you and keep you. So we get the German with Lutkin's version of the English sort of dancing together. And then I'll invite the whole assembled mob to sing that final Amen, which we've all sung for many years, I think. So that's my piece. I can't remember who's next. I'm sorry.
Well, it's myself.
David?
I'll be going next. So, and again, I'm David G. Neufeld. I'm just another one of the many David Neufelds that you might know in Mennonite communities across Canada. There are legions of us. So I'll be telling you about the Niagara bus tour. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Let's see. I'll share this. And that's my first slide. So it's a full day bus tour that will be taking some of you folks on, or some of the folks coming for the centenary celebrations. We'll be leaving, it is a very full day. We'll be leaving the Crown Plaza Hotel bright and early at 8:30 a.m. to make our way down to Vineland in the Niagara region. En route, I myself and Harold Thiessen will provide some background to the Vineland area and to the tour that we'll be going on. To just say a few more things before I sort of get to some of the things we'll be seeing, as Henry had said, close to 1,000 Russlaender came to Ontario in 1924, and a large number, went to the Vineland area as well as the Markham area. And in Vineland, they were hosted by the Moyer, later the First Mennonite Congregation or Church, and that is the oldest Mennonite congregation in Canada. The people of the so-called Old Mennonite Conference, or Swiss Mennonites, had arrived in the Niagara region in 1786 from Pennsylvania. Now, when we reach Vineland, we'll be picking up a couple of local tour guides from the area there, and we'll be picking up Alf Redekop and Maria Clausen, who are local residents. Alf and Maria are now both retired and living in St. Catharines, Ontario. Alf is originally from Virgil and spent over 25 years working as a Mennonite archivist in Winnipeg, and some of you will know all about Alf. Maria Clausen spent a career as a teacher and is originally from the Vineland area. Both have a very keen interest in local Mennonite history of the Niagara Peninsula. So as I said, this tour will visit the first Mennonite church. The original Moyer Church was built in 1810, and the version you see pictured here was built in 1962. As well as the church, we'll see the historic Mennonite burial ground, which dates back to the 1700s, as well as the bicentennial monument erected in 1986. So that was 200 years of Mennonites in Canada. The morning tour will travel through the rural Vineland and Jordan landscape, which is the heart of fruit growing country and Niagara wine country. Now, in the Niagara area was not initially attractive to the Russlaender immigrants, as Henry had said. The farming style was very different from their experience in the Ukraine, and many came just to the Niagara area seasonally or subsequently moved out west. However, families did find that they could often work together in seasonal employment, working in orchards or in greenhouses, and this did appeal to them and did cause many to stay or many more to come back. So the tour will pass some of the first farms purchased by Russlander immigrants, as well as local industries, canneries, and farms which employed the newcomers. And you'll see that's the Fretz greenhouses, which employed quite a few people back at that time. The tour will pass early meeting locations and churches, the Vineland United Mennonite Home for the Aged, the current Vineland United Mennonite Church built in 1957, the current Vineland Mennonite Brethren Church, now the Southridge Community Church, the site of the Coop Sisters Obstetrical Nursing Home, as well as local stories of immigration provided by descendants and local families who will do some step-on storytelling as we pass their farm on the way. Boxed lunches will have been provided and picked up prior to boarding the bus in Kitchener, and we'll be stopping for lunch at the Niagara United Mennonite Church, pictured in the top left there. As Russlander Mennonites continued to arrive in the Niagara Peninsula through the 1930s, after the 1920s and such, and as well after World War II, settlement areas expanded into Virgil and Niagara-on-the-Lake areas, as well as the city of St. Catharines. Tour guides will discuss when and why Mennonites began to move to the St. Catharines and the rapid growth of the community from 1934 to 1939. Some points of interest that we'll be passing and pointing out will include the Queen Elizabeth Way. You kind of can't miss that, but it's really significant for the development of the Niagara region with the QEW expansion, the growth of the Welland Ship Canal, and automotive factories, which many Russlander immigrants, of course, moving into St. Catharines and the Niagara area, became employed in industry as opposed to farming. And that's that particular shot on the top right, you'll see is the GM automotive plant where a lot of people did work. I should point out that the young group down in the right there, the center fellow eating watermelon there, that's my dad. The Niagara-on-the-Lake and Virgil areas are still fruit country with the growing of tender fruits such as peaches, plums, cherries. Although the wide range of so-called tender fruit production is still very active in the area, and we'll be seeing a lot of that, because the farms in the Virgil area, of course, were purchased by Russlaender immigrants, and they made them very productive. And they were not just in Virgil, of course, but also in the Vineland area. But the local wine industry has very much begun to dominate local agriculture. Our tour will be in the Niagara area during cherry season, and if we're lucky, we might be able to stop at a roadside stand to sample some of the local sweet cherries that'll be growing at that time. And many of us who grew up in the Vineland, Niagara area can remember working in those orchards and picking fruit on those farms. The afternoon tour will further trace the expansion of Ruslender settlement into Virgil and Niagara, as I mentioned, and including many who returned from the West to move into that area. And there was a lot of movement back and forth, and particularly coming for the reasons of moving into working in urban settings and an industry in that area. Sites visited will include the former site of Virgil Bible School, Eden High School, Bethany Mennonite Church, the Niagara Credit Union, Pleasant Manor, the site of the former wall canning factory, which employed a number of Ruslender as well. Virgil Mennonite Brethren Church, now Cornerstone Community Church, and a large old colony Mennonite school. So if that hasn't been long enough at this point, the tour will include a stop for shopping at Palatine Hills Winery, one of the many wineries in the area, and this one particular one owned by the John and Barbara Neufeld family, descendants of Ruslender Mennonites. Finally, after our stop at Palatine Hills, we'll take a trip over to the Niagara Parkway and make our way up to Niagara Falls for a short 20 to 30 minute viewing of Niagara Falls before taking a busload of very tired participants back to KW for supper. And that's what our tour is going to look like. I'll just stop my share right there and turn it over to Ed, who is talking about the local tour here.
Happy to do that. As already has been noted, and will no doubt become commonplace over the tour, one of the unique features of the landing of Ruslender Mennonites in Waterloo in the 1920s was being greeted by co-religionists, folks who'd already settled in that area 100 years before, easily. It would be a mistake among those settling groups to assume friendship was immediate and that understanding was thorough. However, over the years, understanding has increased, affection has been found, relationships have grown, and perhaps most importantly, diversity between Mennonite communities has persisted. So in recognition of one aspect of that diversity, the KW tour will travel through parts of the region that are home for old order groups of Mennonites. Words like separate, peculiar, plain, or conservative have all been used to try to label these groups. The labels, of course, don't increase understanding, but conversation and contact does. We'll travel rural roads north of the city of Waterloo. We'll note the distinct architecture and plan of some old order farmsteads, as you see in the image at the top left of the screen. We'll visit with a retired teacher and leader in the old order parochial school system. We'll see verdant and abundant land and expressions of institutional complex community living, all part of that old order aspect of life. The second interesting feature of the KW tour will be that we'll travel through parts of what's also known as the Queen's Bush. It was land the Crown had assumed as a reserve for clergy. However, before it was surveyed and sold, its first settlers were Black African Americans. Having fled slavery, oppression, and diminished prospects, they settled in this area. By the early 1900s, not many of the Black settlers remained. When the land was surveyed for sale, their agricultural investments in the area were not credited to them. They migrated to other cities, Guelph, Brantford, Toronto, and other opportunities. As we tour through this area, it's mostly markers of absence that will hold our attention, as you see in the top right of the screen. Old gravestones from cemeteries and markers of their congregations, the Methodist in particular. We include this in the tour to recognize that Ruslender migratory challenges were not unique, and this is nothing new to say. We include it to offer respectful deference to those who suffered their own dire circumstances and cohabited these spaces. Perhaps most importantly, we acknowledge and add these to the tour as a pledge toward justice and peace for all peoples, regardless. In Cross Hill, the bottom left of the screen, you will notice the Old Colony Church, and not a half kilometer down the road, Cross Hill Mennonite Church, part of the Mennonite Church Eastern Canada. After Cross Hill built their new church, the Old Colony group bought the old one, a present example of ongoing collaboration between different types of Mennonites. Who benefits? Maybe we all do. And as we wend our way south into Wilmot Township, we may stop at the Rushes Cemetery in Wellesley, bottom right-hand corner of the screen, and there we may test our intellect on the Bean Memorial Puzzle, a unique and engaging way in which two women from early Swiss Mennonite communities were memorialized. Finally, we'll end our journey at 118 Peel Street in New Hamburg. Today, that's Jocelyn Insurance. 100 years ago, its second floor was home to a Ruslender congregation, which included both General Conference and Mennonite Brethren people, a historic witness of unity. I'm excited to hear Ron Matthey's reflection on that experience. He grew up in that community as part of those early years. So that's part of the KW tour.
Thank you, everyone. That was a lot of fascinating and diverse bits of information that hopefully will be of special interest to those of you here tonight who are participating in the first leg of the train tour, but also to those of you who are on other legs of the tour and are interested in the history. We have, our time is almost up, but I think we can take maybe 10 minutes for questions. If you type those into the Q&A, preferably not into the chat, but I'll try to manage both. While you're thinking of a question, I just wanted to thank Aileen and the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies very much for hosting this webinar tonight. The center has done an amazing job and is a real gift to Mennonites and others across the world, actually, in hosting such a steady stream of webinars over the last few years. So thanks, Aileen. A question about recording, replay transcript. Yes, you want to say anything about that, Aileen? Yes, you do record.
Yes, we do record. It'll be on the YouTube channel, so look out for an email. A question about events available in Ontario for those who are not on the train tour. Well, first of all, I would encourage you to look at the website that Laureen introduced you to, with a link to many resources about Ruslender history. The July 10th concert, the Memory of Place, that Leonard Enns talked about, and that I put a link in the chat to, that is a public
event in the evening in Waterloo, and the details are in that link. You don't need to buy tickets. And the tours, certainly we will think about reprising them. As Henry would have mentioned, the Ruslender story in Ontario really begins in 1924. So next year is the real 100th anniversary year in Ontario. So we'll see how the tours go this summer, and maybe we'll do them again in the future. And I hope that people on the first leg of the tour have been chatting with each other or meeting with each other in the back room of this webinar, because I know there's some here, and hopefully this gives you a taste of what you will experience. The link to the concert was in the chat, but I can put it in again. Sorry, I can only multitask so well, or not so well, actually. Again, the public can come to this concert, which I'm just putting a link in the chat to now, which will be, it will include Len's composition, The Memory of Place, but there will be readings and him singing interspersed in his 4 movement composition. I think it will be really a wonderful evening. So I just put the link in the chat again, and I hope people are seeing it. Well, if there are no further questions, I'll turn it back to you, Aileen, to wrap things up, and offer thanks to all of our presenters and to you for hosting tonight.
Thank you, Marlene, and thank you to all the presenters and for everyone who took time out of their schedule to join us. We're all looking forward to the Ruslender tour, and hope to see you all soon on the train or at the various public events across the country.